Tonight, a ceasefire is still holding in the Middle East. With President Biden in office for only 121 days, he's faced a number of unexpected challenges. This week, it was navigating deadly violence between Israel and Hamas. Thursday, both sides agreed to pause the fighting. White House sources tell me behind the scenes, President Biden, in very frank terms, pushed Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to make a deal. Here's the president on Thursday.
Palestinians and Israelis equally deserve to live safely and securely and to enjoy equal measures of freedom, prosperity, and democracy. My administration will continue our quiet and relentless diplomacy toward that end. I believe we have a genuine opportunity.
But as President Biden affirmed the U.S. relationship with Israel, he faced pushback from his own party. Progressive Democrats are trying to block a $735 million weapon sale to Israel. And later tonight, we will discuss the political war in Washington, where most Republican lawmakers are refusing to back a bipartisan deal to investigate January 6th. Joining me tonight are four of Washington's best journalists: Asma, Khalid, political correspondent for NPR and co-host of the NPR Politics podcast; Jeff Zeleny, chief national affairs correspondent for CNN. And joining me in studio, I'm so happy to have people around the table: Andrea Mitchell, chief Washington correspondent and chief foreign affairs correspondent for NBC News and host of MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell Reports; and Rachel Scott, congressional correspondent for ABC News. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Andrea, I want to start with you. You have so much good reporting on this Middle East story that unfolded this week. Tell me, behind the scenes, how did we get to this point, and will this ceasefire last?
We don't know if it's going to last. That's certainly the hope. But it is, as you said, fragile. And the president really decided very, very early on that he had to stop Israel from invading, that really was the important thing, and to persuade Israel that it should not invade, because he felt that if they invaded, if it became a land invasion, that this would stretch out as it had in 2014. He didn't want months and months of a conflict. It was already, in the very opening hours, Hamas was firing more rockets and further and with more precision than in previous engagements. So he knew that Netanyahu had to retaliate, and he was insistent that they emphasize Israel's right to defend itself. And that, as it continued day by day, did alienate not only the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, but some Democratic moderates, some allies, senators like Chris Murphy and Tim Kaine and Jeanine Shaheen were all telling me and others that they thought that the U.S. needed to call for an immediate ceasefire right away. But the president's decision was that you can't back Bibi Netanyahu into a corner. And I think from his years of experience as the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, then 8 years as vice president, when President Obama famously had a very cold relationship with Netanyahu, Vice President Biden then was sort of the go-between, the Bibi whisperer, trying to communicate and keep channels open, and that is his nature. And I think that it was that and the intensive diplomacy, and the key to it really was Egypt, was persuading Egypt to show it could deliver results from Hamas. And 4 days before the ceasefire finally came together, Egypt finally showed that they could get Hamas to stop firing the long-range rockets into Tel Aviv. And that was such a red line with the Israelis, such a hot button for them. And when those rockets stopped, the U.S. side knew that, Hamas might deal. And then it was time to start escalating the pressure on Netanyahu and saying, you've done enough, you've got to pull back, it's time for peace.
Jeff, I want to turn to you. Andrea just laid out the complicated nature of this. Talk to me a little bit about how this gets even more complicated when you think of what is going on in the Democratic Party and the shifting politics there when it comes to the Middle East.
Well, President Biden saw that directly as he was traveling to Michigan on Tuesday, of course, promoting his domestic agenda, his economic agenda. He was doing that in Dearborn, Michigan. That had long been on the White House schedule. Well, of course, Dearborn, Michigan, just a suburb of Detroit, is home to the largest Arab American population in the country. So there were protests preceding his trip and during his trip there, and it really laid bare, the challenges here. And this is not something that President Biden has ever wanted in his foreign policy menu of options here. He knows that the Middle East is intractable. There's very little that a U.S. president can do. So certainly his presidency up until now has been focused on domestic concerns. But this was indeed, no matter how you slice it, the first foreign policy crisis of his administration. And it is that experience, the long experience Andrew was talking about as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, as vice president, that really guided him through this. And it could have gone either way. It still can go either way. The ceasefire is holding at this hour, and there is some reason to think it will going forward. But the president still does not want the Middle East to be dominating his foreign policy agenda. Of course, he's focused on China and Russia and everything here at home. But this is all happening as he's about to step onto the world stage, traveling next month for the first time as president overseas to meet with the world leaders at NATO, the G7, and a likely summit with Vladimir Putin. So he was eager to get this behind him, on the back burner, if you will. And it did take that quiet, intense diplomacy, as he's calling it. It's the beginning of the Biden doctrine. And we'll see as the days go on here how much credit he actually deserves for bringing this ceasefire, because really both sides had done a lot, and there would have been a lot of retribution from around the world if Prime Minister Netanyahu had launched a ground invasion and Hamas had struck many targets. So he was really joining a process already in play, but it would not have happened without him and the intervention of Egypt as well. So this is a first test for him. But you could just see this is one reason he was elected, because of experience he brings to this, the confidence that he dealt with this, talking to Bibi Netanyahu 6 times over 11 days was pretty extraordinary.
And Jeff is talking about this being a test. Asma, I want to come to you. There's the Biden doctrine, this being his first test. What's your reporting tell you, though, about the ability of progressive Democrats in particular to nudge the president when it comes to his views on the Middle East?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Jeff was saying. I think that the challenge for Joe Biden, though, at this point, is that progressives tell me, both analysts as well as operatives, that the situation on the ground domestically, when we talk about U.S. politics as well as in Israel, has changed. They are dealing with a Benjamin Netanyahu who's embraced the American right, and they've embraced him back. And then also, there is a growing power of social justice movements, of racial justice movements here in the U.S. within the Democratic Party. In my reporting, one of the most fascinating things I discovered is that some of these alliances were formed on the ground in Ferguson, Missouri, in Florida, after Trayvon Martin was killed, where you had Black activists and Palestinian activists joining forces. And in fact, there were delegations sent that Palestinians helped organize, of one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, to Israel to see how Palestinians were living. And over time, you've just seen younger activists, you've seen this progressive wing of the party be more vocal. And this is something that, Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor under the Obama administration, mentioned to me this week. He said there was never this type of vocal, outspoken protest that they had from the left when it came to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as we've seen this week.
Rachel, what Asma's talking about is this real meshing of racial justice and the Palestinian cause. I want to talk to you a little bit about how all of this is playing out on Capitol Hill. What's your reporting say?
Yeah, well, and Congressman Rashida Tlaib, I mean, I don't think I've ever been so curious as to what was going on a tarmac before. Right. 8 minutes, you had her talking to the president.
The hands out, holding.
It seemed a little tense, and I was talking to an aide in her office, and it was confrontational. I mean, she pressed the president on this issue, and she feels like the White House needed to do more and do more sooner. And this is very personal to her. I think when we talk about the change in politics and the progressive wing, I don't think we have ever seen so many lawmakers, progressive lawmakers on the House floor speaking out, sharing these stories, and then pressing the president directly in front of the cameras for that long, putting that pressure on President Joe Biden. Clearly, I think there was a little bit of wiggle room here. I think they pushed him a little bit to speak out a little bit more about the rights of Palestinians and what they are going through. We saw that in some of his statements this week as well. But the question is for progressives is, does he think he's going far enough on it?
Andrea, I want to turn to you. The president of South Korea was at the White House today. Jeff talked a bit about this Middle East issue upending the politics that President Biden had, the priorities that he had. Tell me a little bit about what's going on here and what you see as all of this playing out.
Well, the fact that he kept it focused today on China, on North Korea, the mutual threat, and also sort of reasserting the alliance with South Korea and Japan has been so important. The only previous leader who came before the South Korean visit was the Japanese prime minister. And so this is another instance, just as the Middle East was, where this is so different from the Trump foreign policy agenda because, well, first of all, the discipline. You saw over all these 10, 11 days on the Middle East that the president never broke secrecy, never answered, drive-by questions.
Yeah.
He stiffed
We
reporters
tried.
day after day, I know, despite all of you guys trying. And again, on North Korea, there'll be no love letters between Joe Biden and Kim Jong-un, none of those beautiful letters, none of the overt threats back and forth, and this kind of roller coaster of emotional personal diplomacy. He wants some commitments before they meet, but he is willing to meet, but he wants denuclearization, which was the same goal as the Trump White House. But it's not going to be as personalized. It's going to be much more substantive. And this was really reassuring to South Korea. Very important meeting today, where President Trump, in his first meeting in Singapore, when I was there covering that summit with Kim Jong-un, agreed without telling his defense secretary, Jim Mattis, that he was going to cancel the joint exercises, the military exercises with the U.S. and South Korea, which was a bedrock of preparation and readiness and also signals to the North. And to do that unilaterally without telling his advisors, his cabinet secretaries, was pretty startling, and they still have not been resumed, other than tabletop exercises.
Yeah.
So this was basically getting back to the substance of what you could call a normal U.S. foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.